Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Tonight is December 31st, 2022, and I'm going to be reading from the manual that is Redemption Manual 4.5. Had some issues earlier tonight. I think we've got them ironed out, and we're going to be reading from Redemption 4.5. Again, my Discerning What is True channel is here, actually on Facebook and actually also on YouTube. So the chapter I'm reading now is called How It Was Created. Now let's turn our attention to how the Federal Reserve System came into being. In 1907, an event occurred which became known as the Money Panic of 1907. The panic was caused because there was not enough money in circulation for everyone to pay their bills and employees to pay wages. It resulted in large-scale layoffs because there was not enough money to pay the employees. A study of the Panic of 1873, 1893, and 1907 found that these panics were the result of international bankers. The panic resulted in a public outcry for the military social government construct monetary system to be stabilized. The so-called president, that's Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, signed a bill in 1908 that created the agency known as the National Monetary Commission. The so-called Senator, Mr. Nelson Aldrich, was appointed to the head of the commission that was charged with finding a solution to the problem based upon Mullen's works in page 1. By 1910, Mr. Nelson Aldrich had not released a report to the government. And on November 22, 1910, a group of men met at Hoboken, New Jersey train station. Now, this is interesting when you look at Mr. Nelson Aldrich here, that he was appointed to be the he was involved in National Monetary Commission. That was in 1908. But they waited almost 2.5 years to do anything. Okay. So a group of men met at Hoboken, New Jersey train station. These men boarded a private car that was bound for Brunswick, Georgia. Their eventual destination was a private hunting lodge on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. 8 men were in the group. And we've talked about this earlier, but I'll talk about it anyway. They included Senator, that is, Mr. Nelson Aldrich, and his private secretary, Shelton, Mr. Abraham Pyatt Andrew, Frank Vanderlip, Henry P. Davison, Charles D. Norton, Benjamin Strong, and Paul M. Warburg. Warburg is the key factor here. Also, Abraham Andrew was the Assistant Secretary of Treasury and Special Assistant to the National Monetary Commission. Frank Vanderlip was president of the National City Bank of New York, most powerful banker at that time. Frank Vanderlip represented William Rockefeller in the International Banking House of Kuhn, Lowe and Company. Henry P. Davison was a senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company called Charles D. Norton, was the president of First National Bank of New York that was owned by J.P. Morgan. Benjamin Strong was a head also of J.P. Morgan, but it was Bankers Trust Company. Paul Warburg was a partner in Kuhn, Lowe and Company in New York and was representing the Rothschild banking dynasty. These men represented what was known as the Money Kings Trust. The group also represented the two most powerful banking cartels in America, the Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group. And they also represented the two most powerful banking cartels in Europe, which is the Rothschilds and the Warburg Group. When all of these are combined, that represented an estimate of 1/4 of the world's wealth. That was in 1910, folks. This is based upon The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin, page 6. The Money Kings group had journeyed over 1,000 miles, that is, cloaked in secrecy, to draft banking and currency legislation which the National Monetary Commission had been ordered to prepare in public. Why the secrecy? Because the public would have been outraged to think that these Money Kings groups was drafting the very legislation which was supposed to protect the public from privatized Money King trusts. What were the main points of this plan, the private cartel group, which represented 1/4 of the wealth of the world created at Jekyll Island? The plan would create a central bank that would fulfill the typical function of a central bank, among them creating fractional and fiat money. The Federal Reserve bankers would consist of a system of 12 banks. The creation of 12 regional banks which would disguise the fact that the Federal Reserve System is a central bank. Private individuals who would profit from the ownership of shares would own the central bank. The bankers would be allegedly controlled by Congress and would be answerable to the governor. But the majority of the directors were to be chosen directly or indirectly by the bankers in the Association of Banks. The President of the United States would appoint the governors of the Federal Reserve Board, but the Federal Advisory Council, meeting with the governors, would do the real work. You see, this is all, show, but it's nothing. It doesn't work. You see, there's the president. We'll get it more into it. Directors of the 12 Federal Reserve banks would choose the Federal Advisory Council. The administration of the regional banks would be appointed by the president using his executive power. This removed them from total congressional control. In other words, you see what's going on here. It's just one man now is going to be controlling this, would be the president. Though it would be concealed from the public, the New York bankers, the Money King Trust, would dominate the Federal Reserve System. So the bank that is in New York City would be the primary bank. The other 11, that is, would be what I call figureheads. Administration of the Federal Reserve System would control the nation's money and credit. At the time of the retreat, members of the media found out about the meeting. There were a few stories run about the meeting, but it was largely covered up. When those who were involved were asked about it, they would deny that it had taken place, or they would say it was a duck hunting trip. Much later, after the Federal Reserve Act was passed, some of the members were a little more forthcoming with information, but for the most part, they were still fairly quiet. The reason for the cover-up was obvious. It was clearly understood that if the public found out who drafted the legislation, such legislation would never become law. After the plan was drafted at Jekyll Island, all-out effort was put forth to get this proposal legislation passed in the so-called military Congress. A group of bankers contributed $5 million to fund a favorable public relations campaign to sell the so-called Americans on the plan. The so-called President, Mr. Woodrow Wilson, was also enlisted to support the plan. Three of the top universities, that was Princeton, Harvard, and University of Chicago, came out in support of the plan. Two of the leading campaigners for the plan were a professor from the University of Chicago. This university had been endowed by John D. Rockefeller, one of the forces behind the plan, with nearly $50 million. This is based upon Eustace Mullins' works on page 10 and 11. When the plan had been introduced from the military Congress, so-called Congressman, that is Charles Lindbergh, that is the father of the famous aviator, had this to say in testimony before the Committee on Rules on December 15, 1911. This is based upon Mullins' work. I find our financial system is a false one, a huge burden on the people. I have alleged that there is a money trust. The Aldrich plan is a scheme plainly in the interest of the trust. Why does the money trust press so hard for the Aldrich plan now, before the people know what the money trust has been doing? Mullins' book, page 11, Federal Reserve. That same year, the American Bankers Association came out in favor of the so-called Senator Nelson Aldrich plan. But what came out in congressional hearing was the fact that the leaders of the ABA rammed it through the annual meeting and gave no opportunity for the opposition to be expressed. The so-called congressman, that is Carter Glass, was the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee. Congressman Carter Glass was a member of the Democratic Party, who was opposed to the so-called Senator Nelson Aldrich plan. Senator Nelson Aldrich was a Republican to the Republican Party. The committee heard testimony about the so-called Senator Nelson Aldrich plan. Andrew Frame, who was present at the ABA meeting, had this to say in testimony before a committee. When that monetary bill was given to the country, it was but for a few days previous to the meeting of the American Bankers Association in New Orleans in 1911. There was not one bank in 100 who had read that bill. We had 12 addresses in favor of it. General Hambry of Austin, Texas, wrote a letter to President Watts asking for a hearing against the bill. He did not get a very courteous answer. I refused to vote on it, and a great many other bankers did likewise. They throttled all argument. They would not allow anyone on the program who was not in favor of the bill, based upon, again, Eustace Mullins' work on page 13. Andrew Frame went on to testify that in the next annual meeting of the ABA, the Senator Nelson Aldrich plan was not endorsed again. he said that a lot of opposition had developed in the ABA to the plan by this point, and that the supporters of the plan never asked for another endorsement. See, this is how things are rigged, folks. Congressman Carter Glass summarized the reasons for opposing the Senators Nelson Aldrich plan. The plan lacked adequate government or public control of the banking mechanism it was set up. The plan gave most of its voting control of the large banks in the system. These were the banks that were controlled by the Money King Trust. The plan had extreme inherent danger of causing inflation of the currency. The bond funding portion of the plan gave the false impression that the system would cost the government nothing. Continued. The plan contained great danger of banking monopoly. The plan would in fact set up a central bank that would fulfill all the typical functions of a central bank. It would control the so-called nation's money and credit. The private stockholders would use the credit of the government for his or her own profits. With these points made clear, opposition to the plan developed and it was defeated. In fact, the Aldrich plan never came to a vote in Congress because Republicans lost control of the House in 1910 and subsequently lost the Senate and the presidency in 1912. The so-called presidential campaign of 1912 was one of the most interesting political upsets in so-called American history. The incumbent, that is William Taft, was popular and the Republican Party was firmly in control of the so-called Senate due to its period of general prosperity. The Democratic Party challenger was Woodrow Wilson, so-called governor of New Jersey, and had no alleged national recognition. Both parties included a monetary reform bill in their platform. The Republicans had the Senator Nelson Aldrich plan that had been denounced as a Wall Street plan. The Democrats had what they called the Federal Reserve Act. Neither party told the public that the plans were almost identical. William Taft seemed a shoo-in for re-election. But then Theodore Roosevelt threw his hat in the ring under the Bull Moose Party. Theodore Roosevelt was well financed and had enormous press coverage, more than the other two candidates combined. See, this is how they did this whole thing. Just watch what goes on here. As a former so-called Republican president, it was obvious that Theodore Roosevelt would cut into votes that would have gone to William Taft. They do this on purpose, folks. Similar to what happened in the election of 1992 with George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot. Ross Perot took votes away from against George Bush in order for Bill Clinton to come in the office. It was done that way on purpose. Anyway, I'm off the can. The bankers were financing all three candidates so that they would win no matter who was elected. Later, congressional testimony showed that Kumlo Company, Felix Warburg, not a U.S. resident, but Paul Warburg's brother, supported William Taft. Paul Warburg and Joseph Schiff supported Woodrow Wilson, and Otto Kahn, I think that should be Otto Kuhn, supported Theodore Roosevelt. Mullins, page 19. It seems likely that the identification of the Senator Nelson Aldrich plan as a Wall Street plan would make it difficult to pass in the Democratic Party-controlled military Congress, whereas a successful Democrat candidate supported by a Democratic Congress would be able to pass a central banking plan. Theodore Roosevelt was used to split the William Taft vote because the bankers doubted William Taft would give the Senator Nelson Aldrich plan a pass. The final electoral vote in the 1912 election was Woodrow Wilson received 409 electoral votes. Theodore Roosevelt received 167. William Taft was only 15. In 1912, after the Democrats had taken control, they held their own hearing on banking reforms. They were held under the House Banking and Currency Committee, which was now chaired by Arsene Puget of Louisiana. A special councilman, Samuel Otomeyer, appointed by Chairman Arsene Puget, conducted the hearings. The hearings dragged on for 5 months and produced over 6,000 pages of testimony. Samuel Otomeyer refused to allow either so-called Senator LaFollette or Congressman Lemon to testify. So here it is, a stacked deck, folks. Anytime they do this kind of stuff, stacked deck, it means you're in deep shit. Okay. Even though it was the pressure that they had exerted which caused the hearings to be held, both men strongly opposed a central bank. They didn't want these people to be heard. Samuel Otemeyer was a specialist in banking history, but he refused to ask any of the bankers who testified any tough questions. He didn't ask about the system of interlocking directories, though through which the banking industry was already controlled. He didn't ask about the international gold movements, which were known to be a major factor in the money payments of 1873, 1893, and 1907. He also didn't ask about the relationship between the so-called American bankers and those who controlled the central banks of Europe. Samuel Otemeyer did not seem concerned that many major international banking houses had branches on Wall Street and already controlled substantial portions of Wall Street activity, even though the fact was well known on Wall Street. The sham hearings ended without a single well-known opponent to a central bank plan testifying. The two most influential men involved in the passage of the Federal Reserve Act were Paul Warburg and so-called Colonel Edward Mandell House. Paul Warburg was the chief architect of the plan that was developed at Jekyll Island Retreat. Here's a quote from Paul Warburg when he testified before the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1913. I'm a member of the banking house of Kuhn Lowe and Company. I came over to this country in 1902, having been born and educated in the banking business in Hamburg, Germany, and studied banking in London and Paris, and have gone all over the world. In the panic of 1907, the first suggestion I made was to let us get a national clearinghouse. The Aldrich plan contains some things which are simply fundamentally rules of banking. Your aim in this plan, the Federal Reserve Act, must be the same, controlling a centralization of reserves, mobilizing commercial credit, and getting elastic note issues, based upon Mullen's work, page 21. The so-called Colonel Edward Mandell House was in agreement with Paul Warburg on plans for a central bank, including provisions that would severely limit control by the government. Here's a quote from him illustrating this point. This is Edward Mandell House. I am also suggesting that the central board be increased from 4 members to 5, and that the terms lengthened from 8 to 10 years. This would give stability and would take away the power of a president to change the personnel of the board during a single term of office. Of course it would be. This is based upon Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law, Colonel Elijah Eli Garrison, page 337. The so-called Colonel Edward Mandell House phrase, take away the power of a president, is significant. Later on, these so-called presidents would find themselves helpless to change the directions of the military social government construct because they did not have the power to change the composition of the Federal Reserve Board by attaining a majority of like-minded people during their term of office. So you see, this is all a stacked deck immensely. They made sure of this. Colonel Garrison's book also revealed the role of that Paul Warburg and the international banking family of Rothschilds played in the central banking plan. Paul Warburg is the man who gets the Federal Reserve Act together after the so-called Senator Nelson Aldrich plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition. The mastermind of both plans was no other than Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. So what I'm trying to explain to you is this. They're poo-pooing the idea. The bills are similar. Okay, so their bills are almost identical. They will act like there's differences, but they're almost identical. But what they do is they poo-poo the issue deal by Senator Aldrich because it was a Republican deal. And the Republicans did not win the presidency, and it actually lost control of the Senate. And so what was taking place now was they were going to change that plan and push the Federal Reserve Act. And they're poo-pooing Nelson Aldrich's plan. Okay, so this is just a way of controlling the narrative here. To further understand Colonel Edward Mandell's House view, one must look no further than the book being anchored that is authored in 1911 entitled Mr. Philip Drew, that is DRU, Administrator. B.W. Hewson of New York published the book anonymously. It's supposed to be a fictional work, but it actually is a detailed plan of the future condition of the so-called military social government construct of the United States. It predicted the passage of gradual income tax, assessed profits taxes, unemployment insurance, and Social Security, and a flexible currency system. This is all to do with the Fabians, if you think about it. This whole thing is happening. It happened already in England in the late 1800s. Within 20 years or less, it's happening here in the United States. In short, it outlines the plans that were followed by both administrations of the so-called president, Mr. Woodrow Wilson and Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In 1955, Westbrook Pegler, P-E-G-L-E-R, economist for the Hearst Publications, wrote an article about Colonel Edward Mandell House and his book. One of the institutions outlined in the book, entitled Mr. Philip Drew, the administrator, is the Federal Reserve System. The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Coons, and the Rockefellers, and the Morgans, that is the international bankers, put their faith in Colonel Edward Mandell House. That is Schiff, Warburg, Rockefeller, and Morgan interests were personally represented in the mysterious conference at Jekyll Island. The so-called Colonel Edward Mandell House was a close friend and personal advisor to the acting president. He was more than a personal friend, folks. He knew the psyche of Woodrow Wilson, and he used it. That's my interjection. He was able to get many of the socialist ideas outlined in his book implemented into law. Among them was the old age pension, labor insurance compensation, cooperative markets, a Federal Reserve System, a cooperative loans, and national employment bureaus. The relationship between Colonel Edward Mandell House and the acting president Woodrow Wilson was chronicled in this book entitled The Strangest Friendship in History. That is Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House by George Sylvester Birek. I'll spell that for you, spelled B-I-E-R-E-C-K. The author asked Colonel Edward Mandell House about the purpose of Wilson and House, and Colonel Edward Mandell House responded, to translate into legislation certain liberal and progressive ideas. Let me just make it clear. The word progressive is actually, yes, it is liberal, but it's also to be more of a communist socialistic perspective. Okay, so it's not conservative. And it's all based upon, we go back to the Fabians, as they used this whole idea, was to help the poor people. But the problem is, here's the problem. These were well-to-do people, these Fabians. But what they wanted to do was to force government to tax the middle class and hurt them in order to help the poor. Okay? But these people themselves would never give any money to help the poor. Or if they did, it was a waste of what I would call being philanthropist. That is, it would look good on, like Rockefeller would give out dimes and stuff to the kids, as though that was something, oh, he's such a nice guy. It's all PR. From this quote, it should be evident that Paul Warburg, agent of international brokers at Kumlo Company, is one of the most influential of this group. It is obvious from this quote that there is little difference between Senator Nelson Alger's plan and the Federal Reserve Act. It is also obvious that Paul Warburg is lobbying for a central bank that has the power to issue currency known as elastic notes. Paul Warburg did a lot of work behind the scenes to get the plan passed. In fact, he worked overtime, much overtime. The man made, before he even was involved in this, he made $500,000 a year, folks. $500,000, $500,000 in the early 1900s is a lot of money. We have already seen evidence that the international banks would go to extraordinary measures to get what they want. There is some evidence to indicate that the powerful international banks who gave us the Federal Reserve System will stop at nothing to have the power of the central bank solely in the hands alone. 3 acting American presidents have expressed concern over central banks, that is, issuing currency. Each of those acting presidents had been assassinated. The so-called President Abraham Lincoln planned to issue non-interest bearing notes he called greenbacks. The so-called President James A. Garfield made a pronouncement on currency problems just before he was killed, and the acting President John F. Kennedy planned to issue federal U.S. notes without using the Federal Reserve notes, that is, meaning or involving interest just before he was killed. It would be difficult to prove that the international bankers were involved in those assassinations, but it is very strange coincidence that persons more than a shadow of reasonable doubt that the assassinations could have not have been done by any other group of people than the international bankers. Who else would have had the power and influence, both outside and inside of the military social government construct, to successfully cover up events as well as they have been done? We also have to go back to Andrew Jackson, who was also to be assassinated. They failed. Two attempts. They failed. And so there were there were actually four presidents actually, and one was not, the first one was not killed. But James A. Garfield was killed, John Kennedy was killed, and Abraham Lincoln was killed. On September 18, 1913, the Colonel Edward Mandell House version of the Federal Reserve Act passed by a vote of 287 to 85. Not even close. On December 19th, the so-called Senate version of the bill passed a vote of 54 to 34. But there were over 40 differences between the bills. The opponents to the bill in both houses were led to believe that there would be no further action until after the Christmas break. So they did not organize. These guys work incredibly deviously. They'll do anything. They'll do things at night. They'll do things, unbelievable what they'll do. And then the media is all for it. They don't share this stuff. As the so-called congressmen prepared to leave Washington, supporters of the bill quickly took advantage of the situation. In a single day, all of the disputes about the bill were ironed out in conference committees, and the bill was brought to a vote. The bill was passed on December 22nd, 1913, the so-called House of Representatives by 282 to 60. So you see the votes have changed. That is from the 18th to the 22nd. There were 287 votes that were for it, and it was only 282. So there's 5 votes less, but there are 25 less people opposing it, which was 85 at first and now 60. And the alleged Senate by 43 to 23. So that number has dropped significantly. There's 22 less people voting totally in that election. So this tells you that a lot of these have already gone home. Okay. Some of the bill's most vocal critics had already left Washington. It was a long-standing political courtesy that important legislation would not be acted upon during the week before Christmas. The so-called President, Mr. Woodrow Wilson, signed the measure into law the very next day. They didn't waste time, folks. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the members of the Federal Reserve Board had 10-year terms, but the Banking Act of 1935 lengthened those terms to 14 years. This meant that the directors of the so-called nation's finances, although not elected by the people, held office longer than 3 acting presidential terms. Yeah. And that happened. The Banking Act of 1935 is under Franklin Roosevelt. So, what's happening here simply is that. We'll continue. Anyway, Colonel Edward Mandell House remained active behind the scenes during both the so-called President Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. Shortly before Colonel Mandell died in 1938, he confided in his biographer, Mr. Charles Seymour, his continued role in the so-called President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. So this is his statement. During the past 15 years, I have been close to the center of things. Although few people suspected, no important foreigner had come to the United States without talking to me. Wow, that's pretty powerful, folks. In other words, he was talked to before actually he's talked to the president. So I was close to the movement that nominated Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He has given me a free hand in advising him. Yeah, sure, very much so. All the ambassadors have reported to me frequently. So he had enormous power. No one knows who this guy is, you see. The organizing activity of the Federal Reserve System began in early 1914 with the appointment of Organization Committee by the so-called President, that is Woodrow Wilson, the acting president appointing acting Secretary of Treasury William McAdoo, that is the president's son-in-law. Acting Secretary of Agriculture would be David F. Houston, and acting comptroller of the currency was John Williams. The organizing committee selected the location of the decentralized reserve banks. The selection of New York was foregone collusion, since it was the center of finances in the so-called United States. The city of Richmond, Virginia, was also selected, evidently as a payoff to the so-called Congressman Carter Glass, for the role in the passage of the bill. The other selections included the city of Boston, the city of Philadelphia, the city of Cleveland, the city of Chicago, the city of St. Louis, the city of Atlanta, the city of Dallas, and the city of Minneapolis, the city of Kansas City, and the city of San Francisco. In 1937, Ferdinand Luckenberg wrote America's 60 Families that revealed that New York was really the seat of power. Let's see where we're at here time-wise. We got 30 minutes. We'll continue on. What banks don't want you to know. The fate of companies, individuals, and governments is entirely at the mercy of the bankers. Their power is unbridled, both in the creating and granting of loans and also in their arbitrary recall with or without notice. The following quote, taken from the Civil Service Yearbook, that is the organizer of January 1934, makes their intent all too clear. Capital must protect itself in every way. Through combination and through legislation, debts must be collected and loans and mortgages foreclosed as soon as possible. When, through a process of law, the common people have lost their homes, they will be more trackable, more easily governed by the strong arm of the law. Same thing is going on right now. The same thing. Applied by the central power of wealth, under control of leading financiers, people without homes will not quarrel with their leaders because they can't. This is well known among our principal men now engaged in forming an imperialism of capital to govern the world. By dividing the people, we can get them to expand their energies in fighting over questions of no importance to us except as teachers of the common herd. Thus, by discrete action, we can secure for ourselves what has been generally planned and successfully accomplished. The Bankers Manifesto ties in with the so-called United States Senate document, House Joint Resolution 192, 73rd Congress, First Session, Chapter 48, June 5th, 1933. The ultimate ownership of all properties in the state. You hear that? This is when we become a communist country, folks. That's a plank as communism. Individual so-called ownership is only by virtue of government, i.e., law amounting to mere user, and use must be in acceptance with law and subordinate to the necessities of the state. Continue. House Joint Resolution, HJR. Explaining what the bankers don't want you to know about the realities of modern day finances may shatter most of the public's religiously held assumptions about money and bankers. What the general public thinks it knows about money and banking is largely based upon a collection of canarals gleaned from TV, radio, newspaper, and their own personal experience with money and banking. In the following pages, you will find where high bank officials admitted that bankers do create checkbook deposit credits to the credit of their clients' checking account as their loans and investment paying funds. You will also learn how an attorney has successfully avoided a bank foreclosure because the banker admitted to creating the checkbook credits as the fund is loaned to his client. And we're going to stop there. This is going to be a landmark course decision here. I want to share that with you, but it will rather stop now and actually begin this later. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all the comments. And what we're going to do here, give me about a 15 to 20 minute break. And then what I'll do is start this whole thing here with a huge Minnesota court decision that actually changes the table in some ways. Very few people know this. Very few people know this. But I want to share this with people. So we'll be back in a little bit. And I appreciate you guys being here. And we'll talk a little later. Thank you.